Since we had 4 promotional videos of Aemeath in less than 24 hours, I figured it's about time to talk a little about her before the next chapter drops, before we actually get into version 3.1, and before we really dive into Aemeath as a character. I want to talk about something a little earlier than that though. This is my first impression of Aemeath and my thoughts on her character before we properly experience her story in-game. What we've seen so far comes from cinematics, teasers, and short interactions. And somehow in the span of just a few videos, Aemeath clearly is Kuro's new favorite child. So I want to talk about what stood out to me, what I think her role might be going forward, and how my own interpretation changed as more information came out. So let's talk about where we are right now, before 3.1 drops, and before her story really begins. First, I want to go over my impression of what I've seen so far. Aemeath first appeared back in the 3.0 cinematic, before the update even dropped, and right away she felt different. She didn't feel like a side character, she didn't feel like someone meant to disappear after one arc. From the moment she showed up, it felt pretty clear she was going to be important. Probably the most central character in the entire 3.x storyline going forward. What stood out to me early on was her existence itself. People can't perceive her, she can't interact with the physical world, but it wasn't clear why. At first I thought she was an existence closer to what the Shorekeeper is, or some kind of consciousness born from the Exostrider itself, a being tied to the machine rather than a human. That was my initial read, but after the new cinematic and the recent character videos, that theory pretty much falls apart. From what we're shown now, Aemeath wasn't always like this. She was a normal student at Star Torch Academy, one of the candidates training to pilot the Exostrider, and at some point, she resonated with it. Whatever happened in that moment seems to have changed her existence entirely. She went from a normal student to something else, an existence that most people can't perceive, one that can't properly interact with the physical world anymore. And now she's clearly linked to the Exostrider in a way we don't fully understand yet. We don't know what she is, we don't know what that resonance really did to her, but that mystery is exactly why I'm excited about her story. Another thing that stood out to me is her interaction with Rover. At first I wondered if she was another character who knew Rover in their past life, but from what we've seen so far in the cinematics, that doesn't seem to be the case. When she reacts to Rover in the 3.0 cinematic and more recently in the 3.1 cinematic, it doesn't feel like recognition, it feels like surprise. Not surprised at who Rover is, but surprised that Rover can see her at all. And that distinction matters. So right now my read is that they didn't know each other before. Rover is simply the first person or maybe the only one who can perceive her in the physical world. And whatever that means, it feels like it's going to matter a lot going forward. I don't think it needs to be said that Aemeath is going to be important. Kuro makes this pretty obvious. Multiple videos, a cinematic, 2 EPs, all of promotional content before 3.1 even starts. No one looks at that and thinks, well, she's going to have her part in 3.1 and then be sidelines. So the interesting part isn't whatever she matters, it's how the story is choosing to frame her. Because if you look at what those videos actually show, they're not just teasing a powerful character, they're very deliberately showing us a transformation. We already know the basics of what happened to her. A normal student at Star Torch Academy until the moment she resonates with the Exostrider. What's interesting isn't that this happened, is what the story chooses not to explain yet. She resonates with the Exostrider, and whatever that moment was, it fundamentally changes her existence. She goes from being a person to becoming something that doesn't fully belong to the physical world anymore. Most people can't perceive her, she can't interact with things the way she used to. So even though we don't have all the details yet, we're not starting from zero. We already know who she was, and we already see who she is now. What's missing isn't information, it's the meaning behind that change. What exactly did she become? Why did this resonance do that to her? And what did it cost her? That's where the mystery actually is, and I think that's why her introduction works as well as it does. It's not hiding everything, it's giving us just enough to understand the shape of her story, without explaining it away too early. We're not being asked to guess blindly, we're being asked to sit with a gap between who she was and who she became. There's no real question that Rover being able to see Aemeath is going to be important, that's obvious. We have a character who can properly interact with the physical world, a character who most people can't even perceive, and the protagonist who can see her. That's not a throwaway detail, that's not something you add by accident. Of course this is going to matter. The part I find interesting isn't whatever this will be important. It's how restrained the story is about it right now. The cinematic doesn't explain it. The moment is shown very briefly in both cinematics, and then they deliberately end on that note. That tells me this isn't meant to be understood yet. The story isn't asking us to solve it, it's asking us to remember it. And that fits very well with how Aemeath is being framed overall. She's not introduced through exposition, she's introduced through absence, to the idea that she exists but not in a way that the world can easily acknowledge. So Rover being able to see her doesn't feel like a reveal, it feels like a marker, something the story plants early so it can come back to it later, when the context actually exists. And honestly, I like that approach. Instead of explaining everything up front, the story is trusting that this moment will carry weight on its own until it's ready to pay it off. Now, let's talk a little bit about the themes around this character. When I first looked at Aemeath's situation, there were certain themes I expected to see. Tragedy, melancholy, isolation. That's usually where stories like this go. You have a character who can't properly interact with the world, someone most people can see, someone who exists in this in-between state. From the outside, that's clearly tragic. But what surprised me is that Aemeath herself doesn't really feel like a tragic character, at least not in the way I expected. In all of her appearances, in the cinematics, in the shorts videos, the EPs, she comes across as lively. She smiles, she jokes, she has energy, even in a situation that on paper should be completely overwhelming. And that contrast really stood out to me. Even the 3.1 EP reflects that. There is melancholy there, you can feel it under the surface, but it's not drowning in it. If anything, the song feels hopeful, which honestly caught me off guard, in a good way, because the easy route here would have been to lean fully into tragedy, to frame her as someone crushed by her circumstances, to make her story heavy from the start. But that's not what they did. Instead, it feels like Aemeath herself doesn't view her existence as purely tragic. That doesn't mean she isn't hurting, it doesn't mean there's no sadness there. But she doesn't seem defined by it either. And I really like that choice. It makes her feel more human, more resilient, and honestly more interesting. We don't know yet how deeply the story is going to explore how she actually feels about her situation, and I'm sure it will, eventually. But the fact that Kuro didn't rush to frame her as miserable or broken makes me a lot more curious about where the story is going. Because tragedy is familiar, hope in a situation like this isn't. There's also a more personal reason why this approach to Aemeath character works for me. I'm not someone who dislikes tragedy outright. I can enjoy it when it's thoughtful, when it has space to breathe, and when it isn't just there to force an emotional reaction. There are games where tragedy is very much on the surface, where suffering is part of the identity of the story itself. Something like that can work, and it clearly works for a lot of people. But that kind of tragedy, the very on-the-nose, constant kind, has never really been for me. Not because it's bad, but because it often feels like it wants you to feel something before you had the chance to connect to the character. And that's why I appreciate the way Aemeath is written so far. From the outside, her situation is absolutely tragic. There's no denying that. But the story doesn't immediately frame her as a doomed girl. She isn't introduced through despair, she isn't defined by suffering, she isn't reduced to her circumstances. Instead, she feels alive. And because of that, her situation hits differently. By not leaning fully into tragedy from the start, the story avoids turning her into a cliché. She feels more nuanced, more human. It also makes whatever emotional weight her story carries later feel earned rather than imposed. If and when the story decides to explore the darker side of her existence more deeply, it will land harder, because it wasn't the only thing we were shown. And personally, that's the kind of storytelling I connect with a lot more. So, looking at everything we've seen so far, I think what really makes Aemeath stand out isn't just who she is, it's how she's being introduced. We already know enough to understand the shape of her story. We know who she was, we see who she became. But the story is very careful not to rush the meaning of that transformation. Her importance is obvious, her situation is tragic, at least on the surface. And yet the story doesn't rush to define her by that tragedy. Instead, it lets her exist first. It lets her be lively, it lets her be hopeful, it lets her feel human before it asks us to feel sorry for her. And that restraint goes a long way. Right now, Aemeath feels less like a character designed to make us sad and more like a character the story wants us to stay with. Someone whose presence matters, even before we fully understand why. We don't have answers yet, and that's fine, because at this point the story isn't asking us to solve her, it's asking us to pay attention. And honestly, that alone already makes her one of the more interesting characters Wuthering Waves has introduced in a long time. So yeah, those are just my first impressions of Aemeath so far. I obviously still don't know her full story yet, and a lot of this could change once 3.1 actually drops. But based on what I've seen, I'm genuinely curious about where they're taking her. If you enjoy this kind of slower, more narrative focused discussion, feel free to leave a like, it really helps the video. And if you want more story and character talks like this, you can subscribe as well, that's mostly what I do here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.